there'll be 6 questions on this section. So guess where? That's a lot. So they want you to know the rules. So if you want to, make sure that you've covered well this section when you do the study. And this lesson will cover all of the T1 section, and turn to page 77 of the study guide if you would like to follow along. Okay, we'll work up to 8 o'clock and take a break. So the FCC, we used to call it the Friendly Candy Company, Federal Communications Commission, is the agency that regulates and enforces rules for amateur radio service. And Part 97 is the FCC regulations and rules governing the amateur radio service. Remember, we talked about Part 15 for LED lights and other devices that emit low-level amounts of radiation. That's covered in Part 15 of the FCC rules. Amateur radio is Part 97. Commercial radio is another section. One of the 5 purposes of the amateur radio service, as stated in the FCC rules and regulations, is advancing skills in the technical and communication phases of the radio art. So they have to justify, to the American people why they have given this amount of spectrum to amateur radio, and we'll cover the 5 purposes, but probably the most important is the advancing skills of technical and communication phases of the radio art. Okay, so here are the 5 purposes. Provide emergency and public service communications. This is why we're licensed, or why we're granted the spectrum. Enhancing an international goodwill. Again, advancing the skills in the communication, technical. Improving communication and technical skills, that's kind of the same thing. And increasing the number of trained operators and electronic experts. So again, we talked about this in the introduction to ham radio, but the amateur radio means non-professional, i.e. no money made or expenses can be paid or reimbursed. And the amateur comes from the French root word meaning amour, which one who loves the hobby or the art of radio communications. Okay. The FCC Part 97 definition of a beacon, and this could be a beacon from a satellite or a beacon from a remote station. The definition is an amateur station transmitting communications for the purpose of observing propagation or related experimental activities. So there are beacons all around the world, and they are on certain frequencies, and you can look them up, and they typically will be like a beep, 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 and progressively getting weaker. And based on how weak the signal is that you can hear, in other words, if you just hear the first one and none of the others, you can hear it, but your propagation probably isn't that good. But if you can hear all of them as they go down, then that indicates your propagation is better from that point to your point on the earth. Okay, what is it? Now this is again in the rules. What's a space station? The definition of a space station is an amateur station located more than 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. You got to know that. 50 kilometers. Not that it's in outer space or that it's orbiting the Earth. It's 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. Okay, Part 97 also covers willful interference. And the rule states that at no time can you cause willful interference to another station. And this is a biggie, and this is one that's unfortunately violated sometimes, and the FCC and the amateur community as a whole takes it very seriously. So would not suggest you interfere at all. So I mentioned before frequency coordinator. And a frequency coordinator is usually a voluntary association that doesn't regulate. They coordinate certain uses of the frequency. And so the test question is, which of the following entities recommends transmit and receive channels and other parameters for auxiliary and repeater stations? The frequency coordinator. So in Washington State, we have the Western Washington Amateur Relay Association, and it's our frequency coordinator. It's a non-government, it's a volunteer organization, and they are the ones that coordinate frequencies for repeaters. And when we put up our Canterwood repeater a few months ago, I worked with this organization and chose out some frequencies, and they came back with recommendations. Well, that's kind of close to this one, and well, why don't you try this one or that one? And so we chose one, and we went on the air with it after getting the license, and now we're under a test phase to see if there are any complaints of us using this frequency. And so far there've been none, and I don't expect there to be. Ours is a pretty low, it's a 10-watt repeater, pretty low power. Doesn't, we're not on the top of a mountain or a tall building. We are, about 80 feet in the air, and it's got a radius of about 5 miles. So I don't think we're going to have any problems with another repeater on the same frequency. There are at least two repeaters on the same frequency, but one's up in northern Washington and one's down in the Vancouver area. So we're spaced out quite a ways. And we all use different PL tones, the tones to unlock the repeater. So amateur operators in the local or regional area whose stations are eligible to be auxiliary or repeater stations select the frequency coordinator. So yeah, it's kind of a group effort, and everybody gets together and say, okay, we're gonna be the group and go for it. And it fosters cooperation among local amateurs. Okay, that's the frequency coordinator. Okay, now ITU, International Telecommunications Unit. You might wonder about, we talked about the FCC licensed spectrum and our ham bands, and the fact that our 80 meter band is at 3.5 to 4.0 megahertz, and 40 meters is 7.0 to 7.35, whatever. How does that work with other countries? Well, this is where the ITU comes in. And the ITU is actually a segment of the United Nations. They coordinate usage of spectrum amongst the different countries so that they are consistent. Because we certainly wouldn't want, although this has had, and it still does occur, but we wouldn't want broadcast stations in another country like Mexico to be on our 80 meter ham band. And of course, they wouldn't want our 80 meter ham band to be on broadcast frequencies in Mexico. So the countries all coordinate through the ITU for common spectrum use. There are conflicts at times. There's a conflict, I think, in the 440 with Canada, and if you look into the rules, there's um, a notation that you should not be using a particular band of frequency or power north of a certain latitude that cuts across, oh, I don't know, maybe Bellingham or so, because Canada has some frequency spectrum that it could interfere with. So that's the ITU, part of the United Nations Agency for Information and Communications Technology Issues. So ITU has regions. There are 3 regions. We're in the region 2, Africa and Europe and Northern Asia is in 1, and Southern Asia, Oceania is in region 3. And everybody's, Antarctica's in all 3. So what can you use for the rules as a technician? And one of the test questions is, what frequency is in the 6-meter band? And this is, you're just going to have to memorize this for now, or look up this frequency chart so you have a better understanding. The ARRL frequency chart. It is online. I can send you a link. I think I have it upside down. But 6 meters, or you can do the formula. 6 meters is 50 megahertz. So it'll be multiple choice, but the only one close is 50.525 megahertz. And which amateur band are you using when your station is transmitting on 146.52, which is a VHF band on this dual band radio? And the answer is 2 meters. So 144 to 148 megahertz is the 2-meter band. Just going to have to memorize that. And then 28 to 28.5 megahertz is the 10-meter frequency for text, and it's the only band with HF phone privileges. So if you look up in this chart, you can find that on 10 meters that there is a segment, 28 to 28.5, that has a T for voice. And that's for novice, and there's no more novice class, but technician is there. So as a technician, you do have one little HF voice privilege. 10 meters is pretty much unusable until the solar cycle gets better, which we're on the up path right now. Okay. And this subject is, they want you to know that you need to be aware of band edges, the end of the band. And you should avoid using the very edge of the band. And why? All of these are correct. To allow for calibration errors in the transmitter frequency display. In other words, your radio may be a little off, not right on frequency. And so that modulation sidebands do not extend beyond the band edge. And you know, if you tune into a frequency well, we'll use 144.0 right here. Well, your radio may be a little off. Oh, we covered that. The second reason is your modulation is below that frequency and above that frequency. So your modulation could encroach outside of our band. And to allow for transmitter frequency drift. Not so much these days, but in the old days of tube transmitters and receivers, they would drift. You know, they would, after, you know, they may drift quite a bit in the first half hour they're on. Then they tend to, after everything stabilizes heat-wise, they tend to be stable. But it could still happen. So all of those are correct. Why you want to avoid band edges. So what's the, this one I've never come across, but it's on the test. What is the limitation for emissions on the frequencies between 219 and 220 megahertz? And yeah, it's right there. And it's, the limitation is it's fixed digital message forwarding systems only. I have no clue what that is, but it's on the test. Fixed digital message forwarding systems only. Just gonna have to memorize that. Be able to identify it. And then on which HF band does a technician class operator have phone privileges? Same information, asked another way, the 10-meter band only. So the key there is HF, technician, and phone. That combination, 10-meter band only. And then again, same information, but in a different way. The 10-meter band only is the only HF band that technician class licensees have RTTY and data privileges. Data and RTTY usually follow phone in the privileges. So the 10-meter band is the answer. Okay. Subbands for CW. Again, this applies to technicians as well as other classes, but CW is the only mode permitted in the VHF, UHF frequency range of 50.0 to 50.1 megahertz at 6 meters, bottom of the 6-meter band, right here. So CW only. And at the bottom of the 2-meter band, 144 to 144.1. So both of those bands, the bottom end edge is CW Morse code only. Just gonna have to memorize that. Okay, power limits. On, on the HF band, transmitters operated by technicians are restricted to an output power of 200 watts or less. So that segment we were talking about on 10 meters that technicians can operate under, 200 watts only. Or no more than 200 watts. And except for some specific restrictions, what is the maximum peak envelope power output for technician class operators using frequencies above 30 megahertz? And the answer is 1500 watts, which happens to be the maximum power for all classes of license, general and extra class on all the HF bands. So 1500 watts is the max power that any of us can use. But for that question, technician above 30 megahertz, 1500 watts. Oh, we've gone past. Okay, let's take a break. Where's my clock going? Let's be back at 8:14, 2014. Okay. Thank you. Sorry I went past. Okay. So there's such a thing as sharing of radio spectrum. And because of the fact that the amateur radio service is secondary in all or portions of some amateur bands, such as the 70 centimeter band, the 440 band, you might find non-amateur stations in those portions and must avoid interfering with them. So if we are amateurs, our secondary means that somebody else is primary, and we need to avoid them. They don't need to try to avoid us. So that's sharing of spectrum. That's the best question. Okay, amateur licensees or amateur licenses. New ham license classes available from the FCC are, we talked about this before, technician, general, and extra class, or amateur extra. There were other ones. There was a novice and there was an advanced, but they're not issued any longer. So three license classes. The normal term for an FCC issued amateur license is 10 years. Got to know that. How soon after passing the examination for your first amateur radio license may you operate a transmitter on an amateur frequency? And the answer is as soon as your operator station license grant appears in the FCC license database. Okay, and we'll be talking about that more. The FCC license database is called the ULS, or the Universal Licensing System. So you don't have a license until it appears in their database. And the proof is not the paper certificate you have, it's that you're in the database. That's the proof of being licensed. Now this note, I need to upgrade that because it has been taken 1 to 2 weeks after submitting the test. However, I discovered a way to submit the test material, I basically scanned it all and submit it. And I think last test class, we took the test on a Sunday. I uploaded it to the ARRL website, special website for volunteer examiners. And that Sunday night and the next afternoon, the licenses were granted and were in the database. So I can't promise that this time, but we'll hopefully, we hit it just right. It depends on the number of people submitting the licenses over the weekend and what order you're in Monday morning with the ARRL. So how many operator primary station license grants may be held by one person? Who knows? One. Test question. So again, the official amateur radio license authorization is the electronic record in the FCC Universal Licensing System, ULS. Paper licenses are no longer issued as a matter of course. Although you can log into the ULS, the FCC ULS, and print out a paper copy if you choose. And I've done that. And there's my official license. That's what it looks like. And you can also, on this page, when you log in and confirm your license, it'll print out on a full page, and part of this page that I cut off is a small license that you can put in your wallet, a wallet size license. And this is, suitable for framing if you choose. And I recommend you do print it out, and I have it here in my station, and I carry one in my wallet in case anybody ever asked. So again, what is proof of possession of an FCC issued operator primary license grant? It's not having this on the wall or the paper one in your wallet. It's the control operator's primary station license must appear in the FCC ULS Consolidated Licensee Database. Okay. Vanity call signs. I may have mentioned this to you. The call sign, well, first of all, you will be issued a call sign by the FCC in sequential order. And they're now in KJ7 R or something, so RV2T or something like that. And it'll be sequential. And if I submit all the paperwork at the same time, all of you will have, one of you may be TBA and somebody's TBB and TBC and, all of them are. However, those are all 2x3 call signs. And KJ is not the easiest set of letters to pronounce or say, KJ7. And it's even worse phonetically, Kilo Juliet 7. So I'm a big proponent of vanity call signs. And as a technician, you can apply for a vanity call sign. However, you can only apply for a call sign in the 1x3 configuration. So one letter before the number and 3 letters after the number, 1x3. So you have to be an amateur extra to hold a 1x2 or a 2x1. For instance, KA1B is a 2x1, and W1AB would be a 1x2. And you also have to be an amateur extra to have a 2x2 call sign. Like AA7FM is my next door neighbor. So the test question, which of the following is a valid call sign for a technician class amateur radio station? And the answer is K1XXX. It's a 1x3. And the other choices will be 1x2s, 2x1s, or 2x2s. Can't have those until you get amateur extra. Any questions on vanity call signs? And after you get your licenses, did I share with you the ham operator resource shared folder? I did? Okay. In there is a write-up on vanity call signs. What makes a good vanity call sign, how to see what's available, how to apply for it, and so forth. It's all in one document there.
I'm wondering, Doug, is your call sign a vanity sign?
Mine? Oh yeah. Any 1x2 or 2x1 or 2x2 call sign is by nature a vanity call sign.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. If you get a general license, your first license is a general or an extra class. If you just went in and took all 3 tests and got an extra class, I believe you'd get a 1x3. So anything other than a 2x3 and a 1x3 is got to be vanity. But as a technician, you can get a 1x3, and I would recommend it because they're easier to say. You can pick something that's memorable. For many years, my call sign was W7DRM, Delta Romeo Mike. Those are my initials, but it wasn't real memorable to other people. So, I like call signs. Like my wife, she was in the first ham class of ours, the Alpha class, and she got the vanity call sign N7JMM, which happened to be her initials. But repeating letters are really good for call signs to be memorable. So she's Juliet Mike Mike, November 7, Juliet Mike Mike. So again, we covered this in the intro, but these are the call areas. We're in the 7 call area. It's quite a big area. And although your assigned FCC call sign will be a 7 call, if you get a vanity, you do not have to stick to a 7 call area. However, I would really recommend you stay with the 7 call area. Otherwise, if you get a 1 or a 2, you know, people are going to think, oh, are you from New York or Massachusetts? Are you from back east? On the air, it could cause some confusion. So I recommend staying with the call sign, the 7 area. It used to be you had to, but they've relaxed that. Okay. On licensing, there is a grace period following the expiration of your amateur license. Remember, license is good for 10 years, but if you let it expire, you have a 2-year grace period where you can renew it and keep your call sign and not have to take the test again. If you go beyond those 2 years, you will lose that call sign. So I recommend you keep track of when your call sign expires and renew it. If your license has expired and is still within the allowable grace period, transmitting is not allowed until the FCC license database shows that the licensee license has been renewed. So again, it goes back to the FCC database. Until it shows that it's been renewed, you are not legally able to transmit. You can listen all you want. So 2-year grace period, 10-year term. Club licenses. At least 4 persons are required to be members of a club for a club station license to be issued by the FCC. I don't know why they want you to know this, but it's at least 4. So we have a Canterwood Amateur Radio Club, an informal club right now, but that's how I got the call sign Whiskey 7 CW. That's a 2x2 call sign. And only the person named as the trustee on the club station license grant may select a vanity call sign for the club station. So I'm the station trustee, and I applied for. We got some other. I think we got a 2x3 when I applied for the the club license, and then I applied for the vanity Whiskey 7 CW. So, you know what the CW stands for? Yeah. Morse code. No. Canterwood. Okay. This is important. You must provide a mailing address when you register with the FCC, and I'll tell you about that before we get into licensing, but you have to go in and create get your FRN, Federal Registry Number with the FCC. And you have to give a good mailing address. It doesn't have to be your home address. If you have a PO box, or if you don't want your mailing or your home address known to the public, then I'd recommend you get a PO box, because once you are licensed, that is now public record. Your mailing address and the call sign is public record. So something to think about if you don't want your home address listed in public record. I don't have a problem with that. Mine is, but some people might not. So, and you have to keep that mailing address current with the FCC, because if they send you some correspondence and it gets returned by the post office, they're going to cancel your license. So you must keep your address current with the FCC. Okay. Who can you communicate legally? You are allowed to operate your amateur station in a foreign country when the foreign country authorizes it. Just because you have a U.S. amateur license doesn't mean you can operate in any foreign country, only if the foreign country authorizes it. And as a licensed amateur, you may transmit from any vessel or craft located in international waters if it's documented or registered in the United States. So if you go on a Holland America cruise and you want to take your radio, some people do this, you can't automatically, because most of the cruise lines are registered in the Bahamas or wherever, not in the U.S. So you'd need to clear it with the country of registry of the ship, always the ship's captain. So test question is if it's registered in the United States. And what you can do and can't do. Any such language is prohibited that is considered obscene or indecent, stands to reason. So you can't swear on the radio. We're not supposed to. And you cannot transmit music generally, and it's only allowed when incidental to an authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communications. Why there's an exception for manned spacecraft communications, I don't know, because they do the wake up song or something for the astronauts. I don't know, but that's the rule. So generally, it's prohibited to, if you're talking to somebody on the air and say, "Oh, listen to this neat song, I'll play it for you." Can't do it legally. Unknown codes and ciphers are prohibited. Transmitting any codes whose specifications are not published or well known is prohibited. They don't want you communicating with some foreign government, of course, in some code. Now, that doesn't mean you can't use, of course, Morse code is a code, but it's well known. Not everybody can understand it, but there are people that can. RTTY is a code, a radio teletype, but there are common means of decoding it. FT8 and WinLink are digital codes, but again, there's common means of decoding it. So as long as it's common and in the public domain, no problem. So the transmission of codes and ciphers that hide the meaning of a message transmitted by an amateur station is allowed only when transmitting control commands to space stations and or radio controlled craft, aircraft, boats, and so forth. So the reasoning there is that they don't want anybody to be able to decode the control commands for a space station, obviously, for a repeater on a satellite. So it's okay if those codes are kept out of the public domain. And the same thing with model aircraft, boats. By the way, not so much nowadays, but 20 years ago, a lot of RC airplanes and transmitters and receivers were based on ham bands. I had one, and you had to have a license. And so anyway, that's an exception. You don't have to, those codes don't have to be known because you're just controlling something locally.
If I could interrupt with another dumb question, going back to part of the discussion earlier tonight, talking about passing on messages that you have received. And there was one example that had a bunch of numbers and letters that didn't seemingly mean anything. Do you have a responsibility to know what you're passing on?
Good question, and I don't know that I know the answer. Now, I assume that those numbers were some codes used in FEMA or Red Cross or some logistics support. So I don't think they were intended to be hidden or secret. But I would suspect if you thought that they were codes that weren't publicly known, that yeah, you probably shouldn't, unless it's an emergency situation and there was a reason for it.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's ciphers and codes. With whom can you communicate? Which countries are FCC licensed amateur radio stations prohibited from exchanging communications? In other words, what countries can't you talk to? And the answer is any country whose administration has notified the ITU, again, the International Radio Telecommunications Union, that it objects to such communications. So currently, there are none. There are no countries. Even though North Korea has no hams, if they did, there's no prohibition of communicating with them. So that's the answer, but it's kind of like there's nobody there that's has prohibited. Not to say that it can't be in the future. So again, amateur, no paid, no money. The control operator of an amateur station may receive compensation for operating only when communication is incidental to classroom instruction at an educational institution. So it's always been that you can't get paid, but then teachers, they're paid. And when they started putting in ham radio as part of their curriculum, somebody realized that, oh, there's maybe a conflict there, so they made this exception. So teachers are allowed to be paid when it's incidental to classroom instruction. But you can't be paid. If somebody, you're communicating or you have the means of communicating to somebody in Europe, and somebody said, well, I'll pay you $20 if you can get this message through. Can't do it. You can do it for free. So amateur radio operators may use their stations to notify other amateurs of the availability of equipment for sale or trade, but only when the equipment is normally used in an amateur station and such activity is not conducted on a regular basis. So you can't make it a business of selling ham gear over the radio, but you can do it your own gear once in a while, just that, incidental to. And there are nets. There are nets that swap nets on the air that they post equipment for sale. Perfectly fine. It's not your business. Okay, no broadcasting. Generally, no broadcasting. And broadcasting, I mean, you couldn't get your license and say, okay, I'm going to have the Doug Monday show at 5 p.m. Tune in and I'll just talk about whatever. I can't do that. You can't do that. You can create a net, or you can get on the air and talk to somebody, but it has to be two-way. Okay, generally. And the meaning of the term broadcasting in the FCC rules for amateur radio service is transmissions intended for reception by the general public. Okay, not amateurs, not other amateurs. Under which of the following circumstances are amateur stations authorized to transmit signals related to broadcasting, programmed production, or news gathering, assuming no other means is available? Only when such communications directly relate to the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. So there's nothing to prevent us from, if you're driving on Highway 16 and there's an accident, and Highway 16 is blocked southbound. There's nothing to prevent you from getting on the repeater and saying, attention, this is November 7 Delta. I'm at Burnham on Highway 16. The highway is blocked southbound, all lanes are blocked, blah, blah, blah. That's perfectly fine. Okay. Even though it's one way. But one-way communication is allowed only when transmitting. Now, this is another exception. Only when transmitting code practice information bulletins, or transmissions necessary to provide emergency communications. Now, what's code practice? There are Morse code, CW. The ARRL puts out daily code practice sessions, and it's one way only. You just tune into the whoever it is. It's usually a really good signal and at different speeds, and you can practice copying the code. That's allowed. It's been done for years, ever since ham radio began, I think. They also can do information bulletins and do once in a while. Focused on ham radio to other hams, not the general public. And or transmissions necessary, obviously, to provide emergency communications. In other words, if there's a situation that people need to be brought up to speed, you can do that. Otherwise, generally no broadcasting, meaning one-way communication. So what type of international, and key here is international communications, is an FCC licensed amateur radio permitted to make? Stomp, stomp. Communications incidental to the purposes of amateur radio service and remarks of a personal nature. So if you're talking to somebody in a foreign country, international, you can talk about ham radio, you can talk about equipment, you can talk about Morse code, you can talk about DX propagation, anything to do with ham radio, and remarks of a personal nature. You know, hey, we're going to go to Spain in September, blah, blah, blah. They don't want you to talk about politics, religion, anything sensitive, or anything government-like. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. All right. This is a bit may seem a little bit confusing, but there's such a thing as a control operator. It's an important concept in amateur radio. The control operator. The ham radio station must always have a control operator. Now, when I'm holding my radio and talking on it, I'm the licensee and I'm the control operator. And that control operator is responsible for the proper operation of the station. And the default control operator is the station licensee. Okay, so once you get your license, you're going to be the control operator. Now I can have somebody, another ham, my contesting buddy, W7VJ, he can come to my ham shack and operate my station, and he can use his call sign. I must designate him as the control operator. Then he's responsible, well, and I am both, for its proper operation. I can go to his ham shack as part of the contest team, and he can designate me as the control operator, and I can operate with either his call sign or my call sign and communicate. So an amateur station is never permitted to transmit without a control operator. Now, that's sort of a trick question, but that's the book answer. The station licensee is the control operator of an amateur station unless documented to the contrary in the station records. I don't know of well, I guess you can assign another control operator. So, and again, a station licensee must designate a station control operator. If they want to assign a control operator different from themselves, they must designate that control operator. So when the control operator is not the station licensee, the control operator and the station licensee are equally responsible for proper operation of the station. So just because I assign Andrew as control operator, we both are responsible for the operation of my station. Equal blame. Make sense? Okay. But there are exceptions. control operators of the originating station is accountable should a repeater inadvertently retransmit communications that violate FCC rules. So a repeater is a station. A repeater is a radio station. But the person using the repeater with a handheld radio or another radio is the control operator and the originating station, but it's going to be repeated. So even though the repeater repeats something in violation of the rules, the repeater owner isn't responsible. It's the control operator of the originating station, because just the nature of the way repeaters work. Otherwise, somebody would have to be monitoring the repeater all the time. And that's what's the use of having a repeater. So a lot of these rules have formed over the common practice of the amateur radio through the years. And here's another point. The class of operator license held by the control operator determines the transmitting privileges of an amateur station. So if you as a technician came over to my ham shack and wanted to operate on HF, and I assigned you as the control operator, you could only operate on HF on the 10-meter band, that one segment. So even though I am an amateur extra licensee, the privileges go with the control operator's license. That makes sense? Now, here's something else. However, I could bring you over and not designate you control operator and be at your side or within earshot to see what was happening. And I could let you operate my station using my privileges, throughout the HF bands, as long as I maintain as control operator. That makes sense? So it's all about if you're assigned control operator or not, which privileges are being used. So at no time under normal circumstances may a technician class licensee be the control operator of a station operating in an exclusive extra class operator segment of the amateur bands, like I indicated in my example. But if I didn't assign you as control operator, then you could, if I was maintaining awareness and was at hand. Okay, control operators and satellites. Who may be the control operator of a station communicating through an amateur satellite or space station? Any amateur whose license privileges allow them to transmit on the satellite uplink frequency. And these are usually UHF, VHF, so basically any license holder, technician, general, or extra. So that might get confused with the other things. So the key here is that communicating through a satellite or space station, and that's usually UHF, VHF. Any amateur whose privileges allow them to transmit on that UHF, VHF uplink frequencies. Okay, types of control and type control points. There are 3 control types: local control, remote control, and automatic control. So local control is when the operator can directly manipulate the operating of the amateur station. So you on a handheld would be local control. Me at my ham shack HF radio would be local control. Remote control is controls indirectly through radio line, phone link, or internet. So I may have mentioned one of the hams here in Canterwood, Jerry, K4 LAP, has a daughter that has some land in Gig Harbor, some acreage, and he has a remote station there. He has a tower. He had a tower. A tree came down and hit the tower and the antenna, but he's in the process of putting it back up. But he could control that station via the interlink. internet. So that's an example of a remote control station. You can actually join a club and control stations in like the East Coast for better DX to Europe remotely through the internet. So automatic control is control without a control operator being present at the control point. An example of that would be a repeater. The repeater's on 24/7. It's here at my house. I don't have to be here. You know, you can use it. Anybody can use it. As long as there's power here, it's going to operate. So amateur station control point is the location at which the control operator function is performed. So obviously, if it's local control, it's right there. If it's a remote control, the control point is where the operator is controlling the remote station. Okay, control point. And repeater operation is an example of automatic control. Okay. Oh, let's see. I think we're, how we do? We get 10 minutes. We may be able to finish. Okay. Operating stations over the internet is an example of remote control as defined in Part 97. An operating station over the internet, like Echolink, is an example of remote control. The following is true of remote operations. All of these are true. This is remote operations. The control operator must be at the control point. Makes sense. A control operator is required at all times. Even though it's remote, the control operator's got to be at the control point at all times. And the control operator must indirectly manipulate the controls. All those three are true of a remote operation. And local control is transmitting using a handheld radio or anything where you're right there at the controls of the radio. Clear as mud? You know, this control point and remote control is something fairly new with the internet and computers and so forth. So it's gotten a bit tricky, especially when what counts for DX and awards. But anyway, it is what it is. So station identification, and this is real practical information. You must, and you're required to transmit a station identification, your call sign, at least every 10 minutes during and at the end of your communications. So it's common to identify when you begin, and then at least every 10 minutes, and then when you end the communications. You don't have to say your call sign every time you transmit and say over, or go back and forth from the other station. You don't have to identify his call sign and yours call sign each time, but you do have to at least once every 10 minutes. And most of us probably overdo that for fear of exceeding the 10 minutes. But what that means is, we talked about the kerchunk. When you kerchunk a repeater, I'm going to kerchunk our Canterwood repeater here. And it identified NN7D. So I have to identify there because I transmit. There's no way to kerchunk or activate the repeater unless you transmit. And if you transmit, you have to identify. Okay, so the only time an amateur station may transmit without identifying is when transmitting signals to control a model aircraft or craft, boat, car, whatever. Again, out of practicality. And English language is the only acceptable language for use for station identification when operating in a phone subband. So if you're talking by voice, US rules, English is the only acceptable language for identifying your call sign. You can send your call sign using CW or phone sending to the phone is required for a station transmitting a phone signal. So if you're transmitting via voice or phone, you can identify either by saying your call sign or with a CW tone. And repeaters. Our repeater is set up for a voice ID, but it's also set up for a CW. If somebody's talking, it'll come in with just CW. Okay.
So when, excuse me, when it says phone emission there, is that voice?
Yes,
Oh, okay.
voice, phone. And what are the rules regarding the use of phonetic alphabet for station identification and amateur radio service? It's not required, but it is encouraged. And one of the distracting wrong answers is it's required. So don't fall into that. It's only encouraged. Phonetic call signs. Okay. Okay, tactical call signs. Tactical call signs are things like your location or the job you're performing. So, you know, when we do our exercises here in Canterwood, we have a Canterwood EOC. We can use a tactical call sign, or block captain 14, or medical team 1, or search and rescue 4. Those would be tactical call signs, and you can use them. It's legal to use. But if you use tactical identifiers, you must still transmit your station FCC assigned call sign at the end of each communication and every 10 minutes during the communication. So same thing applies. So you can, you know, start off with NN7D. Okay, Canterwood EOC to medical team, or medical team, Canterwood EOC, you back and forth. And block captain 14, yes, we're sending the medical team to you. But every 10 minutes, got to come in with the call sign. And once we're done, finish with your call sign. Does that make sense? And we'll cover more in practical lessons after you get your license about use of tactical call signs and some practical examples. Okay, self-assigned indicators. These are things you can add on to the end of your call sign. And a real common one is mobile or QRP, or if you're in a different call area, you can say /3 or /2. So when you'd use this, if I'm mobile in my car and I get on the radio, I'll say NN7D mobile. Or if I'm on a boat, you'd say NN7D maritime mobile. Or if you're in an airplane, call sign aeronautical mobile. Let's see. Tim, did you ever, yeah, you used HF in the Air Force, right?
We finally got it at Alaska flying to Hawaii.
Yeah.
And it was amazing how crystal clear the communication was.
Yeah, well, good. The only plane I flew that had an HF radio was the F-16 ADF model. And it had a 3-way mic button on the throttle. Talk about getting confused. One way was VHF, one way was UHF radio, and then the third way was the HF. And I was licensed then, and I'd get on, you know, if I was going cross country or on the wing, recovering from a mission and had some time, I'd get on usually 20 or 40 meters ham bands and, you know, identify aeronautical mobile. And usually people would ask, well, what kind of plane? And then I'd say, Foxtrot 16 or F-16. And they'd either not believe me or they'd go crazy. But anyway, that was kind of fun. So the test question related to this is all of these choices are correct when choosing a format for self-identify or self-assigned indicators that are acceptable when identifying using a phone transmission, again, voice. And that would be your call sign stroke W3 or stroke mobile, or call sign slant W3, or call sign / W3. So all three of those terms are acceptable and interchangeable. Kind of a trick question, who cares? But it's kind of obscure. But it's in the rules. Okay, third-party communications. Oh, how many slides we got? I think they're 42. We may have to, let me just cover this and then we'll quit. FCC rules authorize transmission of non-emergency third-party communications to any station whose government permits such communications. Now, first of all, what's a third-party communication? A third-party communication is one where you're sending a message on behalf of a non-ham, or you have a non-ham that wants to speak to a ham in another country. So it's a third party coming into the communications. You can only do that with a foreign station if that country that they're operating in authorizes with the US third-party communications. And there's a list of countries that do that, but just, and this all occurred because in the days of long distance telephone calls, the telephone companies didn't want competition from amateurs, taking away their traffic, I guess. So anyway, certain countries prohibit third-party communications, and others it's okay. And there's a list available on the internet that shows which ones. So third-party communications are a message from a control operator to another amateur station control operator on behalf of another person. So that's the test question. And another one is, a non-licensed person is allowed to speak to a foreign station using a station under the control of a technician class control operator only if the foreign station is one with which the US has a third-party agreement. So the technician in there is kind of it's really any US amateur license holder. But you can only allow somebody to speak to a foreign station if they have a third-party agreement with the US. Okay, does that make sense? Some of these you're just going to have to memorize and study and go through the ham study and make sure you recognize the proper answer, the correct answer. Okay, this is the last slide in the rules section lesson. Inspections. This FCC rule says that station licensees must make the station and its records available for FCC inspection anytime upon request by an FCC representative. So yes, they could notify you that they want to come and check out your equipment, your ham shack if you have one, and your license and your paperwork. Now, I've never heard of this happening other than in a case where they're investigating malicious interference or some criminal use of a radio. So don't panic. I've been a ham for 56 years or something and never have heard of this happening to someone innocent. So that concludes the lesson on rules and regulations. So we finished all of the T1 section of the question pool. Again, there'll be 6 questions on the test from this section, so it's pretty important. And you should now be testing yourself on hamstudy.org on the following sections: T1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So everything except 5 and 6. So we have 2 lessons left to go. We're almost there. Any questions?